Kerry Fleck, member of the Communist Party of Ireland, Executive Committee, and I'm chairing the meeting this evening. I'm delighted to have you all here, and thanks for coming on such a warm, hot night. One of the hottest we've had in a while. I'm just going to do a very short introduction and introduce our speakers this evening. And the first thing I would like to do is just mention Madge Davidson very briefly. I mean, many of you would have known Madge. I'm a bit too young to really know her well, and you're as a child, but Madge was a communist activist who was heavily involved in a range of struggles, playing a very prominent role in the Northern Ireland Civil Rights Association. She was also involved in Irish anti-apartheid, worked for the Rape Crisis Centre, the Northern Ireland Women's Rights Movement, and also she was involved in anti-war struggles like opposition to the Vietnam War. As a comrade said to me earlier, she's maybe best described as being, in essence, a courageous young woman who committed herself to the struggle for democracy in Northern Ireland, and this led her into many campaigns in defence of the working class people. As many of you know, her contribution to those struggles was cut very short, when she passed away at a young age, a massive loss to our movement, I believe. And this year's lecture actually marks the 10th anniversary since we decided to mark Madge's life and struggles with these annual lectures. So this is now the 10th year in a row we've had this at the Féile. In that time, we've had excellent speakers, really good quality debates. We've been on a range of subjects from, the nature of imperialism, the EU, and the question of building a working class movement for democracy and for socialism. Has always been high on the agenda in those debates. In the 10 years we've been running these lectures, we've also witnessed massive tumult on the international stage. We're watching the outworkings of neoliberalism reaching a crescendo recently. Really that's what we're seeing. We're seeing massive, we're seeing war across the world, continuing destabilization of the Middle East. The almost complete destruction of the public sector with privatizations. That the first meeting, austerity was still hot on the agenda, and we were trying to mobilise around the issues related to austerity. And of course, we've had the rise of the right and the deepening climate crisis. And then, of course, we went straight into the struggle around Brexit. And now we're facing, a global pandemic, and how neoliberal countries are handling that poorly. So I think it's safe to say we're living in a very historic period. We're watching any semblance of democracy, real democracy, being dismantled. So the question for us all, again, at this year's lecture is, how do we build a common platform and raise demands which can mobilise for change? So the topic of tonight's discussion, of course, is no different. It raises many questions. It raises questions on the nature of Brexit and the EU. It raises the issue of the serious prospect now of a border poll for United Ireland. And it raises questions about Ireland's relationship with the EU and what that means for our aspirations for an independent United Ireland. As communists, we're always seeking these types of debates that really are based on objective realities that we're facing, and trying to seek a way forward that's in the interest of working class people. That's what we always hope that these meetings will make a contribution to. And I think that we have two excellent speakers that are going to continue on making that contribution tonight. Our first speaker is going to be Eoin Ó Murchú. He's a former Deputy National Chairperson of the Communist Party of Ireland. He's currently a freelance journalist with Radio na Gaeltachta. Our second speaker is Ray Bassett, and he's a former Irish ambassador and author of the book Ireland and the EU Post-Brexit. So these are two very knowledgeable and experienced speakers, and I think it's going to be an excellent evening. They're going to speak for about 20 minutes each, and then we're going to open up for questions. If people have questions and while they're speaking, pop them into the chat, and I'll take note of them and bring you in when we get to the end. If everyone's happy enough with that, we'll just go ahead. I'll bring Eoin in there. Thank you.
Okay. Well, that's all I'm going to share on my pilots, Marston. The Ray Bassett, the Chevo, or Yeshket Negrania. Where Dave is done 40 Cumannach, as in gesture, Horton, college at these border, Féile to hÉireann, agus an Cangel na hÉireann, leis an Ratten, agus leis an iarAmbasadóir. Greetings from the very, very sunny southeast from County Wexford. And perhaps it's appropriate that I should be here where the United Irishmen fought the last bloody battles of the fight for democracy and equality in 1798 inspired as they were by the Presbyterians of Antrim and Down, just as the issues of democracy, national and inter-community gather pace again in the north. I have two starting points. The first is theoretical, based on the analyses of Wolfe Tone and James Connolly. Tone put forward the proposition that the cause of Ireland's problems of underdevelopment arose from the fact that the Irish people could not control the decisions that affected them. He argued that the way to end this misrule lay in substituting the common name of Irishmen, today we would also say Irish women, for the denominations of Catholic, Protestant, and unity. In other words, that the unity of the Irish people was the way for us all to achieve control of our lives. James Connolly took this further when he proclaimed that we should serve neither king nor Kaiser, but Ireland. In other words, that there was no point in swapping one empire just to go under another. My second starting point is that the issues of continuing strong sectarian divisions of the partition of Ireland, which hinders our capability to develop fully, and the fact that the final power of decision over Irish affairs lies in Brussels, not anywhere in Ireland. These are all part of the democratic challenge which faces us as we struggle to overcome division and underdevelopment. That is to say that there are three aspects of the democratic struggle in Ireland today: equality and parity of esteem for both communities in the north, the ending of partition in conditions of such equality and parity of esteem, with the Protestant community having a short place in the new Ireland, which is to be built, and a full national sovereignty for the Irish people to run our own affairs jointly between all communities in our country. There can obviously, and there will be, no going back to the old days of sectarian unionist supremacy. Northern nationalists in that sense are absolutely right to refuse to accept second-class citizenship, discrimination, denigration, contempt for their culture and themselves, all the issues, in fact, in which Madge Davidson played such an important part in fighting. Unionism as a political force has consistently refused to move on this, and it has worked hard to maintain a cohesiveness within the Protestant working class to support interests that are actually contrary to what they really need. The unionism has conceded only as little as possible when it was not possible not to concede anything at all. How else would it have been possible for the local exploiting classes to keep working class loyalist militancy directed at their Catholic neighbours and fellow workers instead of being directed at the employer class? While some voices in unionism see the impact that demographic change will have on the forthcoming border poll, and coming it is sometime, voices such as those of Peter Robinson and Jeffrey Donaldson, that they must fight a broad-based case for the union, these voices are contradicted by a constant falling back on the old staples of sectarianism. At best, unionism does not know how to make Northern Ireland acceptable to Northern nationalists, and at worst, it doesn't really want to. Northern nationalists have no reason either to be grateful to the Southern state or to look to it for their salvation, as that state has consistently abandoned them over the last 50 years. But they will not and cannot be expected to accept second-class citizenship. In any case, the north of Ireland is clearly not a central or indeed an integral part of Britain's economic priorities. While Britain now has the freedom to ignore EU rules against state aid in order to develop the economy, it is England's red wall which will clearly come first, while Ireland will lag behind, as has always been the case. Indeed, the economic case for a united Ireland, as well as the obvious social, cultural, and especially demographic arguments, are growing in strength and cannot be wished away by relying on a reactionary Britain, either under Tory or indeed under pink Tory Labour rule, a rule that doesn't care about the North at all. The key task, and obviously not an easy one, is to argue the case to the loyalist working class communities that they should not be duped, if you can pardon that pun, by the leaders of unionism, that they should pursue their own interests, which lie in reaching a harmonious accommodation with their Catholic fellow workers, so that investments in progress can be an issue that they directly and with effect participate in. This is where the debate about Brexit comes in. First of all, the Southern Irish state is subject, because of EU membership, to the rules which prevent the measures needed to make unity effective and worthwhile. Secondly, I think it is an absurd illusion to believe that significant sections of the pro-union middle class will abandon the union just to maintain membership of the European Union. The reunification of Ireland can only be made attractive if it enhances the power of the rank and file Protestant population in a new Irish state. And the rise of the so-called centre, such as the Alliance Party vote, the community who are tired of the old sectarian triumphalism and want to move from it, though unsure yet where to go. Membership of the European Union, moreover, is an obvious contradiction to the declared aim of the Republic in 1916, that the Irish people, together in equality, have an inalienable right to control Irish destinies. And if you aren't offering the Protestant community their share of controlling their lives, you are just asking them to swap one empire for another. Of course, the DUP support for Brexit was not based on rejecting the undemocratic character of the EU as such. Instead, it hoped that Brexit could be made, as its critics claim it is, a return to the old imperialist regime, a step to going back to the good old days when British governments unreservedly backed unionism to do as it pleased in the North. This, of course, is not going to happen. But on the other hand, the demand for Irish unity is on the agenda, not because of the desirability of staying in the EU, but because of the impossibility of restoring the old unionist monolith, especially in the light of obvious demographic changes now occurring, and because of the obvious lack of interest of a British government in developing the north of Ireland. It would be much better if unionism, particularly its rank and file sections, was able to be comfortable with unity. But that never has been and never can be a precondition for unification. Whatever legalese may apply, therefore, a border poll is not in the gift of the British government to be allowed or refused to suit their political sense of themselves. It is a political question, and it is political pressure raised on the democratic rights of the Irish people that will ensure a border poll takes place or not. The Irish government should talk directly to the British on all of these issues and not let the EU talk for us, because the EU will pursue its own interests, not necessarily those of the Irish people. And it is truly appalling that the current Taoiseach, Micheál Martin, is the most ardent opponent of a border poll, and more importantly, the most ardent opponent even of getting involved in a debate which is necessary to precede that poll. The EU, of course, has quite clearly used the Irish question for its own purposes, but that doesn't mean that the Irish question doesn't exist. The Dublin government should talk directly to the British government about all matters of common concern, especially about joint interests in trade between Ireland and Britain, about sharing the Irish Sea to the exclusion of the EU, if possible, and about how to make the protocol more effective and iron out the difficulties in the current bureaucracy. In relation to the protocol, now that Britain has left the EU, there has to be a border, either on the island of Ireland or down the Irish Sea, as it is impossible politically and practically to reconstruct an effective border on this island. So we must make the best of the protocol, talking rationally to find viable solutions to what are real problems. One point, though, the protocol does not in itself change the present constitutional situation, even if the EU works to use the protocol to make Brexit more difficult in England. There are real problems with it, as I've said, but these problems can be overcome if the will is there. The difficulty is that the EU wants to use it as a weapon to force Britain to accept the EU's final authority, for example, in regards to agricultural produce, a clear denial of a real Brexit. But equally, Britain wants the issue to use the issue to posture that it is carrying on the anti-EU fight and defend off criticism from the most irredentist of English forces. Just as at the Battle of the Boyne, when two groups of Irishmen confronted each other as to which English monarch would have his head on a coin, so two groups are used today to fight out for a supremacy which actually doesn't concern us. Whichever side wins, we will lose. The third aspect of democracy is the question of national sovereignty. And EU membership, particularly as it evolves into a superstate with its own army, currency, and desire to play a constructing role on the world stage, is a clear rejection of an obstacle to national democracy and sovereignty. My point is that you cannot fight the EU's denial of Irish democracy by accepting partition on the one hand, or by ignoring the difficult task of winning popular support away from the irredentist unionist parties. I believe that in all of this context, Sinn Féin has made a serious mistake in promoting membership of the EU as the purpose of reunification. The fact is that Sinn Féin's demands for state expenditure to rescue the economy, for increased public services, for state-run infrastructural development, all of these run counter to EU rules and practice and are unimplementable without an independent currency. Sinn Féin says it has a policy of critical engagement with the EU, but perhaps it would be good to see a bit more criticism and a bit less engagement. And the same constraints exist for any other political party that argues the case for advancing social control of the economy for the benefit of the working people of Ireland. So in this regard, while the EU works to use the protocol to weaken Brexit and to maintain the so-called European project at our expense, the protocol should not be abandoned, but instead implemented in agreed procedures which smooth out the real problems that exist at the moment. In the long run, if Brexit works out in a positive way, and it can do, and if the EU reveals itself to be a clear obstacle to the socially progressive agenda, as it is, an agenda that is needed north and south, that indeed could be the catalyst which will make southern public opinion more critical of the European Union. Unity, at the end of the day, without independence is a very limited benefit. After all, we had a united country in 1916, but that was not to say that the people did not demand more, did not demand independence. And it is of very little attractiveness at the end of the day if we have a formal unity but no control over our country. We need to face up to the fact that taking control of our economy for the good of the people of Ireland cannot be done while we are subservient to EU control. We must face up to the fact that the EU is trying to regain its momentum towards a federal superstate with its own currency, army, and single foreign policy, a momentum that was actually thrown into doubt by Brexit. The restoration of Irish national sovereignty by leaving the EU, of course, is not a precondition for Irish unification. It is one of the three democratic tasks which should all be fought for concurrently. Advances on one front do not damage the other fronts, but all should be tackled as circumstances dictate. Finally, might I take the liberty of quoting the views of the former president of Sinn Féin, Gerry Adams, who said in the New Ireland Division for the Future in 2005 the following: "The desire to turn the EU into a superpower under the hegemony of the big states, a European superpower that would dispute the world with the US superpower and with other such rising powers as Japan, China, and India, is central to understanding the politics of the EU. This," he said, "of course, is the polar opposite of the democratic and anti-imperial outlook of Irish republicanism, as well as of Democrats and progressive people all over Europe. He went on, not surprisingly, the European-based transnational firms are among the principal lobbyists for further EU integration. They see this as the best way of undermining workers' rights, labour standards, and national welfare states that have been struggled for by the labour movements of the different countries over decades. The EU is unique in the world in that it is a system whereby the supposed sovereign states and their citizens are bound by a continual flow of supranational laws from the EU institutions set above them. This means, of course, he said, that the EU member states are no longer really sovereign or independent. Each successive European treaty has taken further powers from the Irish state and the other member states and transferred them to Brussels, where the Irish people and the peoples of the other member countries no longer are in control of them. We do not delude ourselves or the Irish people that we can enjoy full democracy or national independence as long as the majority of the laws that now bind us are made by people whom we do not elect and over whom we have minimal control. I think those words make a fitting conclusion to the arguments which I also made.
Okay, thank you very much. And Eoin, you're a hard act to follow, but I'll try my best. Firstly, I want to say a big thank you for the opportunity to speak, and particularly from the CPI, and particularly in association with Féile. And I've had a relationship with Féile since the 1990s, right back to the days of Katrina Rowan and various others. And so I'm delighted to take this opportunity to speak on Ireland's relationship with the European Union and how we look forward. I think the first thing when you look at Ireland's relationship with the European Union, there's a big paradox there, and no one has touched on it, how nationalism in Ireland and in Scotland has become entwined with pro-unionist EU feeling. The apparent contradiction in terms seems a particularly Celtic phenomena, whereby those who claim to espouse sovereign self-government are ardently committed to Brussels. And this is coupled with a fierce determination to resist a close relationship with its larger neighbour, England. And of course, the stance to me smacks of the... Now, I fully accept, as I'm sure Eoin will, the opinion of the European Union institutions that their aim is full economic and political union. I believe Brussels has consistently been true to that goal, and all its policies and actions are essentially to support an ever closer union. I've absolutely no doubt about the sincerity of their expressed aspiration. Unfortunately, many in Ireland and in the Republican movement do not accept that and continue to insist, despite all the evidence to the contrary, that we are actually engaged in what's known as the European project in a process of enhanced cooperation between independent sovereign nations. Now, the real reason for our love of the European Union is antipathy towards England. And a touch of Anglophobia will always go down well in Ireland, Scotland, and Wales, where we regularly are inflicted with English overblown view of its own self-importance, and no truer place than in sport, as we know recently. So on an emotional level, I can understand it, but I don't believe it is particularly helpful. Now, I also comprehend why Sinn Féin abandoned its traditional policy towards the European project after decades of principled objections. They did this to broaden their appeal south of the border to a more middle-class electorate. However, if they reread their own statements from the past, they would soon have to agree, and Eoin led one particularly important one there by Gerry Adams, about the centralisation of power in Brussels and the increasing desire of the Eurocrats and federalists to project military might beyond their own borders. They've largely been proven right. I mean, the points they were making in the 80s and 90s are manifestly true. And the protestations of the political rivals who offered comforting words about shared sovereignty and there would never be a European army, and Sinn Féin were trying, and anyone else who opposed the various European treaties were wrong. So why, despite all the evidence piling up against Eurofederalism, why did Sinn Féin change its mind And the answer is very simple. It's political realism. Sinn Féin rightly analysed that outright opposition to the European Union would be a major minus in courting the southern electorate. Now, I hope that the Sinn Féin, as I call it, flip-flop on the issue may indicate that if the circumstances change, they're open to a flip-flop in the other direction. But I also accept that, having dealing with the political parties, particularly in the South, that the Sinn Féin do adopt a more Euro-critical view than the arch-federalists in Fine Gael, Fianna Fáil, and the hopelessly misnamed Irish Labour Party. But I like Owen, I wish to become a bit more critical. Now, looming above everything, of course, is Brexit. And Brexit has, of course, greatly influenced attitudes. In what would I loosely describe as nationalist Ireland, the process of Brexit halted and set in reverse a growing disillusionment with Brussels. People were swamped, particularly here in the South, with negative stories about the British. There were calls that the Brits really wanted a return of empire, and the whole thing was based on essentially on racism. There was little or no understanding or sympathy for reasons for Brexit inside England, which were essentially a peasant or an upward revolt against an establishment rather than an attempt to establish the old order. Irish nationalists could not see the irony of Ireland working hand in glove with the British establishment, including the House of Lords, to thwart the democratic outcome in a neighbouring island. The betrayal of John Redmond, Charles Stewart Parnell, and ultimately Michael Collins, and indeed you could include Edward Carson, was completely lost on them. In mitigation of that, I should point out that the sheer avalanche of media coverage and the negativity of it on Brexit all helped to produce an electorate which was very, very critical and very, very anti-Brexit, particularly here in the Republic. And the media bought 100% the Irish government's line on Brexit. It was a classic example of groupthink, where the media outlets echoed each other, and on most occasions they worked almost as stenographers, reproducing many of the off-the-record briefing by politicians and officials. Now, I've often given those briefings, so you can often see very easily if it's being done in the background, because the reports all have the same phraseology and wording. In pursuing a virulent anti-Brexit policy, the Irish government jettisoned its obligations under the Good Friday Agreement and set out, in my view, on a reckless course of alliance with the Remainers in London and the EU bureaucracy in Brussels. The zeal of Ireland's devotion to Brussels is very hard to rationalise with what's best for the interests of the people of this country. Now, the current establishment failed to read their own history. And just a tiny digression, Ireland had little or no interest in the EEC when it was established in the 1950s. The state of Ireland only became interested in membership to safeguard its agricultural exports to Britain. And I read the archives every evening. I know that sounds very boring, but I read the documents from the period, and especially livestock exports. These represented a major proportion of our overseas trade. In the words of the Secretary of the Department of Finance at the time, T.K. Whittaker, it would be catastrophic for Ireland's food products to be excluded from Britain by the high common EEC tariff. The EEC had absolutely, at that stage, no interest in Ireland as a potential member. The Irish government were told very candidly that all the country offered was surplus agricultural production. So Whittaker and the Department of Foreign Affairs started a new policy and went along to Sean Lemass, and they told him quite candidly, we have to embrace the European project and do so with gusto. We would have to persuade the rest of the European Union that we were committed Europhiles, because we couldn't have our cattle not being exported to Britain. In fact, the member states at that time just asked London, were they in favour of us joining? And the answer was yes. And if it was, we would be swept in on their coattails. However, General de Gaulle, despite his Irish ethnic background, put paid to all that in his veto in January 1963. Therefore, it is clear that our deep devotion to the European project started as a sham. It was an attempt to sell. and it is a sham today. The famed Euro enthusiasm then became part of the Irish state's mantra, and those sprouting it forgot why we adopted it in the first place. Now, I have to admit that the membership of the European Union had greatly benefited Ireland in some respects, and it allowed it to escape its traditional economic backwardness and become much more successful economically. However, whatever arguments you could have for Ireland staying inside the European Union while the UK was there, I believe they're gone now. With Brexit there and the ongoing changes inside the EU, it's very doubtful if it's still in Ireland's interest to stay inside that organisation, which is headed in a direction which is very much against our national interests. In my book, as I say, Ireland and the EU post-Brexit, I argued strongly that this new era, to use some terminology from the peace process, that Ireland would find the EU a much colder house after Brexit. And I think that's been proved today. Today, we continue to express our European devotion. And there is, let's not kid it, there's widespread public support for it, but only in a very shallow way, promoted as it is by an alliance of self-interest in our politicians and our academics, supported by a mediocre media which have forgotten why we ever embarked on this policy. Of course, when public focuses strongly on issues like that are contained in the Nice or Lisbon treaties, this lack of depth and intellectual commitment to the European project is exposed. There are dangerous consequences, however, for the lack of understanding what we're doing, and it's constantly that the Irish public pays the price for that lazy acceptance that we should always be in favour of closer union and that Euro-federalism is good for Ireland. From the moment David Cameron asked Ireland to help stop arch-federalist Jean-Claude Juncker from becoming president of the EU Commission on the basis that it would make the UK, keeping the UK inside the EU more difficult, Ireland has played a hugely unhelpful role to our nearest neighbour and our most important bilateral partner in its desire to lessen EU control. And in this respect, as I said before, we have violated our Good Friday commitment to be a friendly neighbour and partner of the United Kingdom. We were strongly opposed to Cameron again when he came to Brussels, and I was in the civil service at the time, looking for some concessions, especially on migration, which would have allowed the UK to continue inside the EU, but on a different basis. We unashamedly campaigned in Britain against Brexit in a gross interference in the internal affairs of the United Kingdom, but failed to take any part whatsoever in the part of the island where Irish people had a right to vote, and that was in the north, because our government had essentially, under Enda Kenny, lost interest. We constantly have played a negative role. Then after Brexit, our government never accepted the outcome and worked hand in glove with arch-federalists Juncker and Tusk to undermine the efforts of those in Britain who, under Theresa May, was trying to reach a reasonable compromise. We wasted no opportunity in tackling Britain and the right to leave the EU. We watched as Theresa May's career ended enigmatically, and the Irish media ignored the central part our government had played in her demise and the rise of Boris Johnson. Then, when the British government under Johnson decided to strike out on an independent course, Varadkar and Coveney started crying crocodile tears and blaming the woes which have affected Ireland since Brexit on Brexit itself and Johnson and the Johnson administration, without in any way admitting their own actions had helped to bring that situation about. Of course, our docile media failed to take them into account. The Irish border and the threat to the Good Friday Agreement was employed as a weapon to put the Brexiteers on the defensive and to try and keep the United Kingdom within the orbit of the EU, even though the only people who ever threatened a land border in Ireland was Brussels. Now, after all that happened, unfortunately, Ireland moved out of the limelight after the first phase of negotiations, and eaten bread is soon forgotten. So after Ursula von der Leyen made a complete hames of the vaccine procurement process, she decided to make a mockery of all the guff about Brussels' great commitment to the Good Friday Agreement of peace in Ireland, and invoked Article 16 of the Northern Ireland Protocol to establish restrictions between North and South. The EU Commission never consulted the Irish government, the authorities in Belfast, nor the British government. It was a breathtaking display of arrogance by a weak administration in Brussels, trying to look strong. The media and the Irish government should have savaged the Eurocrats for their disastrous mistake. Instead, all we got was lame excuses and of all varieties from the very subdued press. Nationalists in Ireland siding with the new empire's right to ride roughshod over local opinion was an unseemly departure from historical precedents. But that was only the start of what was happening. It was soon followed by an attack on our fishing resources. The great friend of Ireland, Michel Barnier, with his eye on a possible run on the French presidency, decided to offer cuts in the Irish catch in British waters so the French allocation could be protected. There was to be no dividend for Ireland for its servile adherence to Brussels during Brexit. We, of course, have had to endure the worst cuts of any EU member state. The interests of France, Spain, and the Dutch triumphed over Ireland in a clear demonstration of our lowly place in the priorities. I had to admit when the Dublin City University academic Dr. Karen Devine initially reported on the small fraction that Ireland was allocated by the EU of fish in its own waters, I actually had to double check, and I contacted our Department of the Marine under the Freedom of Information Act, and they were very, very unhelpful in providing detailed figures. But thankfully, those figures have come out much more recently, mainly from the fishing industries. And Karen was, of course, completely correct. By value, Ireland gets 15.5% of the fishers of the allocated quota in our waters. This means the vast bulk of our marine resources have been given away to foreign interests, and more importantly, the downstream processing hasn't occurred here. Now, no real self-respecting country should tolerate that outrage. Again, the media, apart from TG Carr, and I'm not saying this just because Eoin is here, but in my opinion, it's by far and away the best Irish station, ignored this national scandal. And just to give an example, Norway exports over 10 billion worth of fish products a year. And even inside the EU, the Danes, with a tiny territorial water, export over 4 billion. In contrast, the figures for the Republic of Ireland are about 300 million the last time I saw it. So the fishermen deserve our support. It continued. We received a sucker punch on the COVID recovery fund, which is probably the worst deal for Ireland since the Brexit. The figures are really astonishing. Ireland is offering up between 16 and 18 billion euro worth of guarantees, while getting in return 900 million. I think it's about 20 to 1. Ireland is the second highest net contributor to this fund per capita. Only Luxembourg contributes more. Ireland is putting more per head into the COVID fund than Germany, France, and the others. Now, this for less expensive deals for Finland, Norway, Austria all caused outrage in the country. There was hardly a murmur from our fourth estate. Now, I know when I was working inside the government, at least the government of Brian Cowan and Brian Nennan knew they were being screwed in the bailout. On that occasion, we were coerced into the arms of the Troika by threats of cutting off our money supply to the banks, a miserable outcome of our unfortunate earlier decision to give up our ability to keep our own currency. Unlike the other two countries which joined with us, Denmark and the United Kingdom, that rightly refused to join the Eurozone. We've also witnessed major threats to the future of our farming community. The decision of the UK government to sign a trade deal with Australia, which will be followed by deals with New Zealand and South American countries, will in essence mean the replacement of our huge beef exports to the United Kingdom. This downward trend has already started. The UK took traditionally about 50% of all the beef produced in the Republic of Ireland and traditionally offered the best price. And of course, it was the main reason why we got interested in the European Union. Now this centuries-old trade is in jeopardy, even if the deals are phased in over on a gradual basis. If we stay inside the EU, I'm afraid the future of Irish farmers looks bleak, and it would be much better off as the farmers are in Switzerland, Iceland, Canada, and Norway, who receive direct financial contribution from their own governments. Again, this development, which is of long-term importance to rural Ireland, is being ignored by the mainstream press. The idea that Ireland should put even more money into the EU budget to support the CAP is laughable, given the tiny percentage of the budget that we receive. Also, when I was writing for the Sunday Business Post, it took me a long time to unearth some figures. and they are again astounding. Figures from the Department of Finance indicate that Ireland, this is apart from the COVID fund, will be net contributors to the EU budget of around 1.5 billion this year. In other words, Dublin will transfer 1.5 billion more to Brussels than it will get back. And there is little or no public comment. Now, most countries are actually quite proud of the fact that they're net contributors. It took a load of Freedom of Information Act requests and various other to actually get the Irish government to admit that it was paying a lot more into Brussels than it was getting back. In fact, if you look at the 1.5 billion figure, the Republic of Ireland citizenry are paying slightly more than the United Kingdom citizens were paying per head as a net contribution. And that money could very well be redirected towards rural families as the main brief market disappears. Also, on the common foreign policy, many of us will recall the plea by Robert Emmet that Ireland should take its place among the nations of the earth and we should have our own voice in international affairs. Now Germany is demanding majority voting in the European Council to decide on a common foreign policy, where Ireland has 1% of the voting power. Why this is happening, I don't know. And people have to ask, why are Irish soldiers today fighting along with the French in EU missions in Mali, where the French are seeking to bolster their own neo-colonial influence? We've come a long way from the days of Frank Eagraithe. Now, when with all that piling up, we have to ask, why stay in the European Union? And the answer always is that it is to do with foreign direct investment. We've used our low corporation tax of 12.5%, but probably much more significantly, the sweetheart deals and the write-offs of the large tech companies to lower the tax taken from some of these companies to obscenely low levels. We have abused the system so much that there's now an international consensus against us, led by the European Commission and the French government. We have become almost a pariah in this respect. If anybody believes that the long term, the Irish Republic can resist these pressures, I'm sure they'll be great believers in the tooth fairy. Of course, multinationals have been good for Ireland in the overall economic sense, but the period when we had an advantage is coming to an end. So how will the Irish media explain that? And we should always remember that access to the European market is not dependent on membership of the EU. The average tariff is today about 2.5%. On a related point to the Irish media, and Owen touched on this, the self-same print journalists who relentlessly denigrated Brexit and Britain are now lining up again in chorus to attack even the Irish government or anybody who dares raise the issue of Irish reunification. Clearly, any sign of nationalism or pride in a country is viewed as a threat by these European devotees. We should never be cowed by that establishment lynch mob. We've every right to seek that ideal in a democratic manner as outlined in the Good Friday Agreement. Calls to change the rules of democracy on this issue and commitments in the agreement are absolutely shameful and should be called out for what they are, anti-democratic. We have at the profoundly dysfunctional media in the southern states. From my own experience in having lived in Belfast at times, it is much better north of the border. I even saw a call by my former colleague to ask the Irish media to stop using the term bloc when referring to the EU, as this might sully the image they're trying to paint. Thank God we have a social media here, and that the British media, with all its faults, has some degree of diversity in it. Now, the legacy media in the Republic have the gall to clamour for public money so they can be sustained as their popularity plummets. The decline of the mainstream press is irreversible, as they no longer reflect people's opinions. The quality is deteriorated, and they've abandoned diversity, which they regard essentially nowadays as a gender form-filling exercise. They proclaim their commitment to the concept of diversity by producing a rigid policy line on issues such as the EU, which reflects no variation of opinion. And I've been told that by journalists that they can't write something which is critical. In conclusion, we need to build an alternative platform where real diversity can be found and not the echo chamber we have today. One journalist, and she's a good friend of mine, recently performed the idea to me that the social media needs to be curbed and that trained journalists should act as gatekeepers to publication, as the untrained media could not cope with unprocessed differing opinions. That person describes herself as a liberal, and that's the mindset we're up against. It is also clear that Brexit has added considerably to a deterioration in community relations and political relations in Northern Ireland. The national slavish adherence to Brussels is a negative factor on this issue. For an Irish government which, under its constitution, is committed to the promotion of Irish unity, this is counterproductive. Any political settlement which brought about an all-Ireland state would bring in hundreds of thousands of future citizens who are very pro-British. They would expect, and would have a right to expect, their attachment to the neighbouring Ireland to be reflected in any new structures or government approaches. The failure of the Irish government to show any sensitivity to their interests would appear to be counterintuitive to unity aspirations. As the political landscape within Northern Ireland changes, and the possibility of both jurisdictions coming together, I believe it would be much better for any arrangement to be outside the European Union by maintaining close relations with both London and Brussels. Finally, the European federal state, with all its trappings of empire, holds no real attraction for the bulk of people who live on this island. It's time to close that chapter in our history. Against that background, I recently tweeted, I said, I wonder whether the people in the Irish civil service and their politicians now think back to their disastrous policy of thwarting David Cameron's attempts at a New Deal for Britain, later their stonewall resistance to Theresa May's efforts at a reasonable compromise on Brexit. In their efforts to promote a false Euro federalism, they've destroyed any lingering pro-EU sentiment in the Tory party, badly damaged Anglo-Irish relations and relations between the traditionally pro-union part of the population in Ireland with the rest of the country, given away our marine resources, transferred billions of taxpayers' money to Brussels, and are now overseeing the destruction of our beef industry and an end to our independent foreign policy. Wonder, will we ever get a mea culpa upon them? No, I guess not. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ray. That was great. Two comprehensive speakers there. Really fantastic. Thank you very much for those contributions. Just going to open up now for questions. There is one already in the chat there from Fra. Fra, do you want me just to read it out, or can't see you? I'll just read it out for you. If you want to jump in, you can. So Fra's question in the chat is, do the speakers believe the current system of government is reformable, north or south, or in a unified state? If not, how do we as a society provide the resources needed to end corruption in government, end capitalism, and ensure a socialist society, to put the needs of the many before the needs of the one? So it's quite a broad question. I think the speakers can maybe see it in the chat. Is anyone else want to ask one as well? While we'll take a couple at the same time. Yes, Raymond. And then Adam. So we'll have a question from Raymond and Adam, and then we'll go back to speakers, if that's okay with our speakers. Raymond, we just need you to unmute. Please, comrade.
Okay.
Thank you.
I just say Ray referred there several times to his lengthy deliberation there on the Irish government's aspirations to national reunification and national sovereignty. And I just don't know what he was referring to, because I'm 65 years old, and in my 65 years, I have never heard any rumblings from the Irish government saying that they are in support even of Irish reunification. In fact, to be honest with you, I believe that at every opportunity they have avoided and opposed any attempts at Irish sovereignty. In fact, Micheál Martin referred to this week as an illegitimate attempt by the IRA to destabilise the country, or words to that effect. So I just would like Ray to elaborate or explain what he was meaning when he was talking about Irish government support for independence.
Thanks, Raymond. Adam, do you want to ask yours now?
Yeah, sure. A couple of years ago, the leader of the Liberals in Europe, Guy Verhofstadt, was speaking to a Lib Dem conference in England, and he made reference to the United States of America, the Russians, the Indians, and the Chinese, I think it was. And he said, each of these each of these is not just a nation, they're essentially a civilization or an empire. And he said, we need an empire. Europe needs, this is a time of empires. And I thought, that's quite strange. That's like saying the loud part quiet. I just wondered, do you think that in that case, that was him maybe overstepping the mark? Or do you think we're going to see a much more overt direction in terms of that, as you say, that federalization? Because I know that the current president, von der Leyen, was previously a big fan of federalization, but played it down whenever she was becoming president of the EU. So just wondering on your thoughts on that. Thanks.
Okay. Does anybody want to come in first, Eoin or Ray? Just unmute and sort of jump in there. Ray, do you maybe want to go first then?
Raymond, I spoke particularly about the onus of the Irish government under its constitutional obligations. But I don't quite agree with you. I know Páirtí Ahern many times spoke of his desire to see a unified state. There was a time, I mean, I was in the civil service, and during the 90s, particularly Gerald Fitzgerald time, there was a sort of McCarthyism down there, that there was such an antagonism to the provost that if anyone showed the slightest degree of sympathy with on civil rights issues or issues relating to Northern Ireland or on that, they were immediately sort of castigated as beyond the pale. So there was an attitude created, which was it was difficult to speak out, particularly when the media were owned by people like Tony O'Reilly and others who were very, very antagonistic. So, during the Hume-Adams negotiations, the government was under savage attack, with sometimes 8 and 10 articles attacking, any moves towards peace. I agree, Micheál Martin has been particularly reticent about speaking. He comes from that kind of side of Fianna Fáil, which was Jack Lynch's time. But Páirtí Ahern certainly spoke of his own desire to see. I know, because I often wrote the speech as well, and I'm sure I often helped to write it.
I know.
so I wouldn't write it off. There was a natural reticence, and I think, Leo Varadkar would always say, is trying to say much more what he thinks than previous ones were, probably because of the atmosphere, and he grew up a bit later than that. And he regularly he speaks of his aspirations and the hope that he hopes to see a united country, a united state here in Ireland. On the other, can I just quick go back to Verhofstadt? Verhofstadt is a kind of an extremist, but he's not the only one of talking about empire. Barroso also called and said the European Union's empire. Do I believe it's going that direction? I believe there are certain people who try and push it in that direction, but I honestly think the European Union has passed its peak, because Ursula von der Leyen does not have anything like the kind of clout that previous, like Jacques Delors and those people had. And I think, they will push on ahead. But the fact that inside the European Union, there are so many strains occurring, that what is the European Union? The German Supreme Court or Constitutional Court has said the European Union is not a state. So what is it? And they have to define it. And I don't think there is any desire outside of a group, a small group who are at the kind of top in Europe in terms of Brussels, who are pushing in that direction. The second most skeptical country on Europe, apart from the United Kingdom, was always France. So, anybody who pushes too far, France is going to get rejected. There isn't the basis of an empire because it doesn't have popular support. And on changes of government, I'm a believer in democracy. The best way to change the system is to get elected and win to win elections. I do agree that the system is unfair because of the way the media is stacked against anybody who's going to ask fundamental questions. But in the end, I'm a believer in democracy because I believe all the other alternatives are worse. Raymond, I hope that doesn't sound too establishment to you.
It does.
Eoin, you want to come in then?
Yeah, I look through them in the reverse order in a sense. We should remember of the 6 original founding members of the European Union, or the EEC as it was, 5 of them had empires. And it was impossible for them after the carnage of the Second World War to re-establish those. The French lost their control of Africa, so did the British and other countries likewise. And coming together was a means whereby they could perhaps restore their strength. What's the Gareth Fitzgerald's dreadful phrase? They could pool their sovereignty to have mastery over others. And I think that while I agree completely with Ray, I think amongst the people of all of these countries, there is no desire to re-establish empires and all that goes with it. The desire by the controlling interests directing the European Union are to try and restore that idea of being able to control and to play a unified part on the world stage as an equal to the United States, China, Russia, and so on. The second point, in a sense, that flows from that is that there is at the moment a very strong drive within the European Union to go back to further centralization and to take more powers into the center. And it is worth remembering Micheál Martin just very recently, after having ludicrously praised the EU vaccine rollout to the skies, said it was in Ireland's interest to support the measures to transfer more powers to the EU. The transfer of more powers means pushing us further and further in the direction of being a province. Why should one province then want to join another province? The second question about the nature of the Irish government, there have been, as Ray rightly points out, the roles played by Bertie Ahern, by Albert Reynolds in a very initial stage. So there have been elements, and there are some elements within the establishment who still maintain the position. But again, as Ray has rightly pointed out, the establishment as a whole, as a cohesive unit, works solidly and in a very united form in newspapers, in the media, in universities, and in the political system against all of that. And that is part of the pressure which they want to bring upon any radical elements within the Dáil. The third question, or really the first question that came up about is the current system of governance in the North reformable? Well, in one sense it is, but the only reform which can ever function is a reform which actually gives complete, genuine equality to both of the communities within the North, and which does so on a basis of mutual respect for all of them. In that context, the question is, where does the economic and social and, if you like, foreign policy interests of the people lie? Does it lie with Britain, in which it is a very minor player way down the road, the last on a long list of elements who'll be looking for resources before the North gets them? Or does it lie in playing an equal part within an Irish state? And I believe that the case for Irish unity is particularly strong, given the complete lack of interest in reviving the Northern economy, which has been evident from British policy for 50 years at least. So in that sense, it is reformable in one sense of people implementing the existing Good Friday Agreement structures. But then that raises the question of where does the real interest lie if people are equal?
Thank you. I'm just going to wrap up here. Can we just thank the speakers again for excellent contributions? Really great. Thank you. Thanks. It's weird trying to clap on Zoom, but there you go. Thank you very much. Yeah, look, tonight's debate's been great. The speakers were very interesting. I think it's really refreshing to talk about this issue from this particular angle, because it's not an angle in which you often get to engage in this issue. As Joe pointed out earlier, often it's all, EU good, Brexit bad, and we don't get beyond that simplistic and look at the objective realities where, making workers' demands will run us into trouble and into a wall with the EU and their policies. So we have to look at it from the objective reality, and hopefully we can take this debate into other forums.